Today I'm going to show you how to make reusable bowl covers, both a single layer and a reversible bowl cover. So let's get to it. So I use some flannel fabric. You can use a quilted cotton fabric or a linen, but whatever you're doing for the single layer one, and that is what we're going to be doing first, just take your bowl, turn it upside down, and then trace around that bowl. You can use any size bowl. Just be sure that whatever you are sewing for is for the specific type of bowl that you are going to be using. Now from that line, I'm going to measure about 2 inches around. I'm using a seam gauge. You can use a ruler. It doesn't matter, just about 2 inches. Then I'm going to use some chalk and I'm going to connect those dots, create a circle. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is a very forgiving sewing project, which makes it great for beginners. So because this is a single layer with no seams, I am going to use a pinking shears to cut that outer circle. This is going to help prevent fraying. And now I'm going to turn over that fabric about an inch and do that all the way around the circle. I find that sewing clips are easier to do for circles, and you are going to be bunching the fabric up just a little bit as you are securing it. That's not a problem. So now I'm going to bring it to the sewing machine, and I am going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and sew all the way around. I'm going to tuck and gather those little folds. It's okay, don't worry about that. But I am going to leave about a 2-inch gap, and that is going to be important. So I backstitched at the beginning and the end of that stitching, by the way. Now we're going to be using elastic. I chose about a 1/4 inch elastic. You could do something a little bit wider, whatever it is that you'd like. I feel that the 1/4 inch kind of is easier to maneuver around the bowl. So now I'm going to take that elastic and just wrap it around the bowl. It doesn't have to be super tight, just has to be the size of the circumference of the bowl. Then I add about an inch just for good measure, and that is going to be because we're going to be knotting it at the end. So I'm going to add a safety pin to the end of the elastic, and then go ahead and find the gap that is in that seam and insert the safety pin, and then start doing like an inchworm motion. You kind of push and pull and push and pull, and that is getting the elastic to go into that casing that you made. Every now and then you're going to need to smooth out that bunched fabric. Just be sure that you don't smooth it out so much that the end of the elastic gets caught up or disappears into the casing. You could put a clip at the end just to make sure that it doesn't disappear into the casing. As you can see, by the time I drew my elastic out of one side, I still had plenty of elastic left on that other side. Might be because I had flannel fabric and so it's a little bit grippier. So just smooth out those bunches a little bit more, and then I'm going to tie a knot in the end of the elastic. Because I used a 1/4 inch, it was easier to tie a knot than to sew the seams. However, you could sew if you're using a thicker elastic. With that extra little inch allowance that I had put in the length of the elastic, by the time I triple knotted it, it created a snug fit. And then I just cut off the ends of the elastic. You could, before doing this, just make sure that the snugness is okay on the bowl. Then I just simply put that elastic back there in the casing and went to the sewing machine using the same seam allowance, and I sewed it shut. You could also hand stitch the seam closed if you'd like. So this is a single layer bowl cover. Using just one single layer of fabric, so you're going to be able to see the wrong side of the fabric when you take it off. Now I'm going to show you how to do a reversible bowl cover with 2 different fabrics. So I chose 2 coordinating patterns, and then just like before, we're going to draw the bowl on the fabric. I used a 2.5 inch width on the side of the bowl on this one. I didn't like it as much as 2 inches, so I will just stick with 2 inches from here on out. So this is an easy hack. Once I did one circle for one fabric, I just folded it in half, folded the other fabric in half, and just traced around this existing circle pattern. That way I didn't have to go through the whole thing again. It just saves some time. So now put the fabric pieces together with the right sides facing each other. Then you are going to stitch around the edge of the circle. I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance again, and then again I left about a 3-inch gap this time because you're going to have to turn this inside out. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of the stitching. So because this is a curved seam, I'm going to come through and do some snips. This is going to make it turn inside out a little easier. I'm a little old school. I was also taught how to make notches. So in a circular seam so that it'll turn inside out a little easier. It also reduces the mass. So either way that you want to do, but just don't do that on the gap where you're going to be turning it inside out because you're going to need to come through and sew that seam later. So now turn that fabric inside out through the gap. Use your fingers or a turning tool or whatever to just push out those seams as you are turning it out all along the edge, just so that you get that good circular look. Now you can iron it at this point if you would like. So after doing that, we're going to measure about 1 inch in and do a stitch all the way around that circle with no gaps. And so what that is going to do is create a casing so that you can put the elastic in. And so it'll be between that finished outer edge and that stitched circle. So if you don't know how to figure out where to stitch, you can use a seam gauge or a ruler. I measured what 1 inch was from my sewing needle. Turns out that it is that farthest out groove that is on that sewing plate. And so just put your outer edge against whatever reference point that you have and let that guide you as you are sewing. Now be sure to use a back stitch at the beginning and end. So this is what it's going to look like. I used a thread color that was going to be complementary to the fabric. Now, just like before, you're going to put the elastic around the bowl, and if you're using a thin elastic, add on about 1 inch extra to allow for knotting it at the end. If you're using a thicker elastic, then you want to allow enough so that you can sew a seam allowance and just make it a little bit snug. Again, inchworm motion, pulling in and out with a safety pin. You can also use something called a sewing bodkin, and that is also great for inserting elastic into casings. Snip off the ends of the elastic, put it back in there in the casing, and then you're going to be finishing off the outer edge. So just tuck under the fabric so that it matches the seam allowance for the rest of your circle. And I chose to go back in with a sewing machine and finish it off. You can also hand sew. So that is how you make these reusable bowl covers. I will put some written instructions in the description below that you can reference. Happy sewing!